passenger rail as a healthcare lifeline. Dr. Breck Lebec is going to be our moderator. This is a very, very important panel because one of the things that we've heard, particularly at the Big Sky meetings, is the inability of rural residents and tribal members to get to regional medical facilities, particularly if the highway is in trouble. And as Dan Bucks talked about, ice conditions, and increasingly with climate change, we see more of these storms and situations. So Performance Rail has incorporated this idea of access for rural residents to healthcare facilities. We're in obviously a very big one. Spokane is home of many regional medical facilities. We could have a whole panel on that. Billings, Montana, Boise, these are places where we need to get folks, particularly as we've heard with rural air service, not what it used to be, get them to the proper facilities. There's only so much you can do with telehealth, which is a great thing, but in the end, you've got to get the patient to the facility. So this panel is going to talk about that. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Breck.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity of talking. Any other docs or medics in the office? In the room? No. What's a doctor doing talking about trains? My first job to pay for college was as a switchman for the Erie Lackawanna in the 70s, just before they went broke. Not my fault. I didn't touch anything. So I learned a lot there. I learned a lot about the risks of railroading, particularly in the yards. And it wasn't until I fast forwarded after some years of time in the Air Force as a flight doc and as a public health doc that I came to understand some of the risks that really can't be seen there. The PM 2.5, you just heard about it at the last panel. I don't have a bunch of slides. I'm formerly a medical school professor, and you usually come with a thick deck of slides to show people. You've seen all those. What we're going to do today is tell stories. When you go see the doc takes a history, his story or her story. And through hundreds, really thousands of years, that's the way that wisdom has been imparted to the next generation, is by telling stories. You won't remember if I showed you facts or figures or grams or that sort of stuff. You're going to have a hard time remembering all that anyway. But I hope that you will remember our stories as we tell you today. So we have a great panel. First is Anna Zievarts, who's with Disability Mobility Initiative, Disability Washington. I have heard Anna speak. I have her book. I didn't bring it with me to show you, but I highly recommend. It's on the table. Thank you. When driving is not an option, you've already heard that 30% of people in Washington, and maybe across the country, either cannot or do not drive for a variety of reasons. How do they get around? We've heard they don't get around on rail yet. We're working on that. Thank you. So she's going to be first if she's queued up here in a moment. And then we believe we have Luella Bryan. Not yet. If she joins us, she will join us. She's from the Crow tribe. Then we'll have Martin Charlo from the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. We'll then have Anna Haliata, thank you, Little from the Yakima Nation. To be followed by Gleb Sitch, who's a third-year medical student at Pacific Northwest University School of Osteopathic Medicine, that's a mouthful, in Yakima. And he will follow her naturally, as you'll hear and see in the story. And then I will wrap with a few comments and then your questions. We will ask you to please hold your applause, not because we wouldn't like to hear it, but as the stories are told, I think they're best heard probably in the silence as you think about that. And so as you hear each story, we will just quietly transition to the next speaker and to the next story or series of stories. And then we'll have time for questions of all of us at the end, if we could. So I'm impressed that you're all still here. I know you didn't stay for us. There's a bunch of senators and representatives. That's why you're here, I know, but thanks for listening to us anyway. Anna, are you there?
Hello, yes, can you hear me?
Problem. Maybe the tech guys can solve that, but hello, Anna, and could you just give us,
Hello.
we'll hear whether we still have the echo. Just count to 1, 2, 3, if you would.
All right, can you hear me? 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3.
Anna, thank you for joining us today remotely. You may or may not explain why you are not here in person, but we're delighted you're here remotely and virtually, and I will sit down as you tell your story. We each will have about 5 minutes to tell a very poignant story, and then we'll come back together. Anna, if you can stay on, then we'll have questions and answers. Anna, thank you. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I do have some slides. I don't know if it's possible to share them or not. I don't have to have them, but let's see. Oh, there they are. They're up. I see them. Wonderful. Okay, great. Well, thank you all for having me. And I wish I could be there in person. I just got back from, oh my gosh, the East Coast last night from Philly, headed to actually to Pullman tonight. So really, really busy book schedule, but it's really wonderful to be here with you all. And I wanted to talk a little bit about non-drivers and the experiences of non-drivers in our community and how important it is that we have transportation access for public health reasons. And, I think about this a lot as someone who grew up outside of Olympia with an eye condition that prevents me from being able to get a driver's license. And so I left. I lived in New York City for many years, and I came back to Washington State. And I'm very fortunate now that I can afford to live in Seattle. And so it's, relatively easy for me to access medical care. But there's so much of our state that isn't accessible for non-drivers. And so I just wanted to go over a really, really sort of broad overview. Who are the sort of different categories of non-drivers that I think about when I'm talking about non-drivers, recognizing that these are all intersecting categories and overlapping categories, and that non-driver isn't a fixed state. There's a continuum of transportation access that's, affected by many factors, including, wealth, is a big one, right? And so, people with disabilities are a big group of non-drivers, people who are low vision, people with mobility disabilities, people with epilepsy, healthcare conditions that can make it hard to drive in particular times of day, or maybe particular days, particular weeks, mental health conditions, anxiety. The list goes on and on. Traumatic brain injuries. Every time I do one of these talks, I feel like someone comes up to me afterwards with another story. So that's one big group of non-drivers. Another big group is people who are aging out of driving. There's a picture here of my grandma. She lived in a rural area in southern Indiana. She kept driving even though she had a heart condition that would cause her to pass out. And she would just drive off the road periodically when she lost consciousness. And luckily, it was rural enough that she didn't hurt herself or hurt anybody else, but definitely wasn't a great situation. But she didn't have other options to get places. People who can't afford to drive are a big percentage of the non-drivers in our state. Also, people who are too young to drive, children and youth who we recognize have to go places. That's why we have school busing systems. And young people who can't afford to drive or are perhaps choosing not to drive for a whole host of reasons. So next slide. And so all together, and I wanted to sort of give you this overview, all together, non-drivers in Washington State constitute about 30% of our population. And this is from a report that was conducted by Tool Design. It was funded by the legislature. It came out in February 2023. And I highly encourage you, if you just Google JTC non-driver study, it will come up. You can dig into all the data. But I wanted to show you this next slide in particular, which is from this report, and it shows percentage of non-drivers by census tract, looking at some of the counties throughout Washington State. And you can see that the area that we're talking about here in the Yakima area in particular, really high percentage of non-drivers. And I think, there's this assumption that people who don't drive are perhaps, like people who live in a big city and it's so nice to be able to bike or take the train everywhere. And that's a percentage of non-drivers, those choice non-drivers. But really there are so many non-drivers who are not driving, not because they would, they don't want to drive, but because it's not an option for them. And we see this a lot in our rural communities and tribal communities in Washington State. and in other states as well. Wisconsin did a similar study, and their highest percentage of non-drivers are also in very rural areas. And I have a young driver who's joining me for this webinar. I thought you had your own webinar. Oh, you finished. Okay, all right. So last two slides, and then I'll turn it over. So really, when we live in places that are not accessible by transit, where there's not sidewalks, when we need to travel long distances, the ways we can get around are really for non-drivers is asking or paying for rides.
I need to see this.
Paying for rides. All right, you need to go somewhere else. Paying for rides is not affordable for many non-drivers, but asking for rides comes with an emotional burden. There's a quote here from Jaime Torres, who's from the Tri-Cities area, from Pasco, who really speaks to, that when you're always asking favors, you can feel like at a certain point you just can't ask favors anymore. And this is also true for situations where people maybe don't have a deep social network, or maybe they're not comfortable asking for a ride to medical care from someone for a whole host of reasons. And so that's why transit is so important, to be able to get out, to have connection with other people, to have a larger support network, even if you do live with other people in your household who have access to cars. So that last slide, transit really is freedom. There's a quote here from Abby Griffith. She lives down in the Vancouver, Washington area. Like me, grew up in a rural part of our state. She grew up in Ridgefield, which now has got a lot of development and has some transit, but when she was growing up, no access. And so she really had to rely on her mother for everything. As far as transportation goes. And when she was able to move into Vancouver and live near a bus, that freedom that she experienced of being able to, do simple things like go to the grocery store was really transformative for her mental health. So I will pass it over to the next speaker and stay on here for questions. Thank you all for having me here.
Thank you, Anu. Again, thank you for your applause, particularly for the next series of stories. I would invite you to hold your applause until those have been told. They're all worthy of applause, and think applause. Do we have Luella? Has she joined us yet? If we do not, she may or may not be able to join us. So I think we'll just move down to the table. You all are welcome to come here, of course, or speak from the table with the mic, wherever you would like to do that from. Martin Charlo from the Confederated Salish and Kudai tribe. Thank you.
I sit for a living like a lot of you people do, so I like to stand up as much as I can. Hesniakuke, Lemunch Pesia, good afternoon. Thank you, everyone. My name is Martin Charlo. I am from the Flathead Indian Reservation in western Montana. That is north of Missoula. If you've ever been to Glacier Park, you've driven through our reservation or the Flathead Lake. There's one of the tourist corridors through western Montana. If you come, please visit and then return to your homes. Thank you. I kind of happened upon the Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority by chance. I was asked to take the role with Dave Strohmeyer and kind of just be one of the spokespeople for the tribe. The bottom part of the passenger rail will run through the southern part of our reservation, and that's a really important kind of connection we've had throughout our history with the railroad. Kind of the sadder part of the railroad is as it was created, the Transcontinental Railroad displaced a lot of Native people. It cut across our hunting grounds, especially the Plains Indians, and displaced a lot of their traditional gathering areas or hunting, and ultimately became the demise of bison and on the plains. And so kind of a sad history with Indian people. We've used it to our benefit though as well. We actually use the rail system to go back to Canada and retrieve some bison to restore our herd, one of the most genetically pure herds of timber bison in the nation on our national bison range that we now own. And so it's something that, we have a mixed history with that. And so getting into the kind of the current times of healthcare and transportation, we are a rural community. We are lucky to have Kalispell and Missoula to the north and south of us, but isolated within, we do have some community hospitals, but if you're ever in the area, I'd advise you to go Missoula or Kalispell because people go, well, let's leave it at that. I love healthcare professionals. You're a great guy. But really, you know, it's something like my dad had a stroke 20-some years ago, and I was driving him to and from Missoula every day for 4 days a week, about 120-mile round trip. You know, it was one of those things where it was occupational therapy, and so it was rain or sleet or snow or whatever else, he was going to get there. And it was one of those things where, you know, that spur that goes from Missoula to the reservation would have been a lot easier to travel. You know, the traveling by rail is so much environmentally friendly. You know, that's one of the things that tribes take pride in is you know, keeping our lands free of pollution, kind of restoring it back to the way it was before. Our cultural practices as far as how we treated the land, how we interacted with the land, and treated it really as a living, breathing entity. And it's one of those things where the amount of traffic that goes up and down 93, the amount of pollution that is caused by that, we are doing everything we can to change that. You know, whether or not it's going electric with our fleet of vehicles that our tribe owns, or doing something like this with the passenger rail and looking at ideas of how we can get people off of 93. You know, we like I said, we love for them to visit because tourism is a huge part of our economy, but it's one of those things where, like I said, people come, they do their thing here, and hopefully they go home. It's one of those things where we aren't adverse to people coming and visiting us, but we've seen the change of it over time. And it's one of those things where right now we're experiencing probably the biggest population boom in the Western Montana since homesteading because of COVID refugees or whatever reason it is. And so the amount of cars on the roads are increasing. The competition for healthcare is increasing as well. And so having access to travel to different areas like Spokane, Seattle, where we really get the specific kind of care is really important to us. And that's the big reason why I think we are venturing into this and really supportive of, you know, the passenger rail. And side note, you know, I rode the passenger rail from Whitefish to Seattle as a kid several times with my dad, and it was probably one of the best and worst experiences I've ever had, because going to Whitefish in the middle of the winter time, or actually arriving back in Whitefish in the middle of the winter time and having a foot of snow on your vehicle is no fun. So yeah, thank you all. Thank you for the opportunity. Lemlich, thank you.
Pollyanna, please.
Good afternoon, my name is Holliana Littlebull. I am a member of the Yakima Nation. I'm also descendant of Nez Perce, Cayuse, and Umatilla and Cree. I have been working in public safety for most of my life. I started out as a wildland firefighter, learned to be a helitack manager, which is somebody who's in charge of the helicopter. Got recruited by the Structure Fire Department, and then got recruited to be a medic. And because I was a medic and I had helicopter experience, I became a flight medic. And in the wintertime, I agree that's very scary, especially when the roads are maybe 30 foot wide and your helicopter wing expansion is about 28. So it can be very scary to work in rural America, especially in the wintertime, to take care of your community members, your coworkers, and other people who work and live in that community. And so one of the things that I want to say as a cancer survivor, living in Yakima, needing specialized care, or having family members who need specialized care who have to travel to Seattle for treatment and or medical care on a regular basis in the wintertime, I think they should put ice skates on cars or change them into snowmobiles or something, because if you have not tried to go over Snoqualmie Pass in the wintertime or White Pass in the wintertime, and you haven't done it before, stay home, please. Because it's very scary when you're used to driving in those kind of winter conditions and you come across people who have no experience whatsoever and they slam on their brakes and, fishtail down the road. And so it's an experience. But that's one thing that you need to understand is that when you come from a tribe who was promised health care in a treaty, and I was asked to explain this, thank you, Bill, I would have ever had not done it, but the treaty came with the agreement between the US government and the tribes. It is something that predates even railroads being laid on the ground on our lands. And so not having multimodal opportunities to have other choices to travel from rural America to the cities or metropolitan areas where the healthcare providers are is extremely difficult. The leaser of the land for our property, his wife got cancer. They went bankrupt. They could not pay for healthcare because farmers did not have healthcare. If you do not take care of your farmers in rural America and they don't have options and other opportunities to transport their goods, whether they're apples or Timothy hay or cherries or beef or milk, where's the food on your table? So that affects your healthcare. That affects your choice theory. If you do not have food, you do not have security. If you don't take care of those people who take care of the food and give them opportunity to travel for healthcare, then you don't have that. And so we need to think about things on a more of a global perspective as where does my bread come from? Where does my milk come from? Where does my apples come from? And think about those people and the farm workers who do not have health care, who utilize trains to travel back and forth between California to Washington because they follow the crops. And without them, we don't have food. So it's a thing where there's like a domino effect, where one thing affects another, and we need to think about those things. If we remove those dominoes, then nothing comes down the line to us. And we need to make sure that we ensure that that line is solid, that there are other options, because as Florida is seeing right now, I'm pretty sure they don't have any trains running. They don't have any cars running. Maybe the boats are running, but I wouldn't advise that, especially with the winds and the turbulence and everything. And so we need to have plans for emergencies. I'm a former emergency management strategic planner. This was my job, to plan for these kind of situations. Worst case scenario, best case scenario, and pray you get something in the middle. And that's something I learned in my career working in public safety, as a firefighter, as a medic, as a police officer, working in Homeland Security. You have to think about what everything and how it affects you. The environmental factors, to how is it going to get there, to how are you going to serve the community you need. And that's what we need to keep at the forefront of our choices. And so if we don't have rail, we don't have other means of opportunity to travel, then that's a problem. And one of the things that I want to say more importantly is rail service was guaranteed to Yakima Nation and pretty much 40 tribes along the Hiawatha for as long as the rail went through their lands. And that is not happening. The trains are going through, but they're not providing service. So we need to make sure that when you are working on projects, include the tribes, because that will make your project stronger. Thank you. Kwa'linu Shmash.
I can see you can't hold it back. It's worth applause. Thank you, Aliana. Gleb Sitch is going to naturally follow that. So Yogi Berra said famously, you can see a lot just by looking. And in medicine, if we don't look for where and what the problems are, we're not going to know what they are. We won't know how to measure them, how to respond. So Gleb and colleagues actually did a survey along through central Washington to say, what are the medical problems there? Gleb, tell us all about it.
Thank you, Breck. I think we have some slides, just a few. But yeah, my name's Gleb. I'm a third-year medical student at PNWU in Yakima. I'm doing my rotations currently in Olympia. I'm from Ukraine originally, but I call Seattle home. Yeah, one day I was talking to my classmates, and we were all talking about how awful it was to have to drive over the pass to see our family. It's like a two and a half hour drive from Yakima. And then we started talking, and we were like, I wonder how bad it is for patients who need to go to a specialty care appointment. And what I mean by specialty care is essentially anything your primary care provider can't do that's more advanced, like colonoscopies or managing complicated hypertension, arrhythmias, cancer. So in partnership with Dr. LeBeg, Charlie, and Gary from All Aboard Washington, as well as my mentor at PNWU, Dr. Anthony Steffes, we ran, thank you. Yep. We ran a survey study that surveyed providers, medical providers, from the corridor connecting Seattle to Tri-Cities through Yakima. I'll skip. Oh, perfect. Sorry, it's a little delayed. Okay, so that's the corridor I'm talking about. And you can see Ellensburg and Yakima are kind of in the middle. So we sent out this survey to providers in these 3 counties that encompass this corridor. And it was primarily Ellensburg and Yakima that were represented. But we asked them a couple different questions. Where do your patients go to get specialty care? How do they get there? What are the transportation barriers patients face? Would a passenger train to the big city help get care? And did you or a provider ever ride trains to get somewhere? And that was more so to get context of what their lived experience is. We did get a decent amount of quantitative data for a bunch of these questions, but the main question I wanted to focus on is that third one: what are the transportation barriers patients face? This was a written response question. We basically just opened up to the respondents to answer however they wish. What barriers do your patients face to get to these appointments? And to kind of specify, we're talking about referred appointments for specialty care that can't be accessed in the corridor. One really good example is in Yakima. I don't know as of today, but as of 2 years ago, you could not get an elective colonoscopy, which is completely unacceptable given the public health hazard that colon cancer has in our country and just the world right now. And so you would have to essentially go to Tri-Cities, Ellensburg, or even as far as Seattle to get that care. But that's just an example. And so what I want to do today is just read some of the stories that these providers have shared with us. I didn't know this is magnetic. The largest problem for access from my area is pediatrics. I work in rural community health in Grandview, Washington. Our patients do not have the means to purchase gas or sometimes even have a car to make it to their appointments for their children. Oncology has also been very difficult to get my patients to, especially the folks who don't have the means or access to telehealth. Another respondent says, I would refer more patients for more unique therapies like ketamine therapy, electroconvulsive therapy, but driving over the mountains is just too stressful for these patients. Another said there are limited specialties in Yakima, particularly gastroenterology, infectious disease, pulmonology, etc., that are either non-existent in town or completely at capacity. And they often have to make do with electronic consultations or very long wait times. And again, stress about traveling over the pass is another issue. This recurring theme of stress crossing the pass, even if it's still open, I get stressed out crossing the pass in the winter. So I can't really imagine someone with physical disability or just need to take their time crossing the pass to get to an appointment, having to make that trip. Another said, I had probably 20 patients in the past year who missed or rescheduled appointments, delaying care, including referrals for potential malignancy, so for cancer, and for high-risk prenatal care. Sometimes they don't miss an appointment, but again, they have huge stress crossing the pass. Around 10 patients in the last year for this respondent said, multiple people needed skilled spinal surgery to avoid potential permanent disability, but are unable to afford transportation to Seattle. And later ended up in the emergency department because their condition worsened to a point and they needed to be airlifted to emergency surgery. So as a quick side note, that's just an exceeding cost that could have easily been avoided if we had invested in our transportation infrastructure. And the rest of the stories are basically these recurring themes. They can't afford to drive, they can't drive themselves, and they just don't have other transportation options. And unfortunately, I think this story is all too true in Central Washington and the rest of our state, where communities are actively suffering because the only way to travel from city to city is by car, and not everyone drive or has the means to drive or can afford to drive. But yeah, that was basically our qualitative data. I just want to thank the people I worked with and also the Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority who largely inspired this study. Hopefully we can get the ball rolling on inspiring more research on this subject, just get the conversation on the intersection of health and transportation, because at least in Central Washington, that's not a conversation we're having. So, thank you.
Thank you, Greg. We are way ahead of time, you'll be delighted to hear. And so I'm going to ask first whether Luella has been able to join us. Tom, have we heard anything at all? Nothing. Okay. If she shows up in the next couple of minutes, we would really like to hear her story. The next one is scheduled for what, 3:45, but we're not going to wait until then. No. What I'd like to do while I tap dance here a moment, Tom, can you pull up my slides? I'm going to show and talk about just a couple of them here. So this is who we are. I would encourage you to look at the WPSR website. Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility began as an anti-nuclear war organization 50 years ago. I don't know any doctors that think nuclear war is a really good idea. Let's have a nuclear war and take care of what's left. Not a good idea. That work continues with that organization, and we have expanded to climate work. That is the effect of climate and the environment on our own health. And my specific personal interest is in the effect of transportation policy on our health. Do I get to click through these? Is that how that works? Yeah, if you'd like. Yeah, we can do that. I'm just going to talk about a couple of things. Here's a debate question over drinks tonight. The negative impacts of freight do not outweigh the economic benefits. Have a look at that truck belching black smoke and put that into your thoughts as you discuss that. We've talked about the implications, the economic implications. We've talked about the political implications. We've talked about the environmental implications. I invite you to think about the health implications of our transport policy. You can go on the Department of Ecology website. This is live all the time. Just look at the Department of Ecology and Google or search for diesel pollution or diesel PM 2.5. And this is what you'll see. The one on the left is the PM 2.5 in the I-5 corridor. I use this slide often whether I'm talking to aviation groups. It's CTAC under the approach and departure pattern, or for those who travel up and down. The one on the right is NOx, nitrous oxide. That's the laughing gas, but it's not funny. The one at the dentist helps you from feeling the pain, but this is the one you're breathing that also affects ozone, right? So that's what that looks like. I'm not going to spend time with this one, the PM 2.5 particles. You know about it. It's about 1/20th the size of a grain of salt or sugar. And that's why they go so deep into our lungs. The picture on the right tells us about that. Some recent information is that it actually gets in our brains. Through the nose, there's a very thin barrier here between the nose, the olfactory bulb, and the brain. And the last paper I saw says that those who have Parkinson's disease are much more likely to have worse Parkinson's disease and worse tremor if they're living in an area with high levels of PM 2.5. Not a good thing. Unfortunately, it's poor people who can't afford to live elsewhere that often live in those areas, as you know. Okay, we froze. Tom, can you give it a kick? What do you think? There we go. Here's Chicago's at the other end of the line, right? So here's a demographic and epidemiologic data from Chicago. Look where the diesel effects are. Of course, where all the people are, but also where all the traffic is. And the various health effects. Don't try to read the fine print. That's what it looks like. Why not take a cruise for some fresh sea breeze? You like a good cruise? That's departing Seattle. Last year, this is 2 hours later on the Salish Sea as the smoke came across from northern Washington and BC. That's what it looked like. PM 2.5 and other kinds of particles, not the fresh sea breeze you signed up and paid for. This one you've probably seen. Don't try to read the fine print. The top line is the short haul flights. Tremendous use of fuel, aircraft fuel, of course, to get to elevation, get to height, to get to altitude. That's why they're such, and these are measured in per passenger mile or for the vehicles per ton hauled. Way down at the bottom, the tiny little area, that's Eurostar. Electrified, goes under the channel. It's a wonderful ride. If you're not taking it, you really must. Wonderful ride. 180 miles an hour, the wine doesn't even tremor on the table. Very nice, very smooth. The run on the right is comparing, it's CARB data, California Air Resources Board, comparing the amount of diesel that we could remove if we went to the tier locomotives, the cleanest locomotives, equivalent to the number of cars off the highway by that, in a year, by that year of 2030. That year, that's the crucial year. We talk about climate effects, 90,000 cars off the freeway. I'll just refer you to this. If you Google WPSR.org/climate, you'll see our climate report. It's about a 100-page document that you can see, you can rely on, use freely to support your climate and health and environment kinds of discussions that you may have in policy making choice. The one on the left is my wife and I and the dinosaur. Thank you, Lusco, for coming to listen to me today. The one on the right, sun-powered Aptera. Aptera is completely powered by solar panels. Full disclosure, I have one on order. It'll travel about, it can charge about 40 miles per day. It can charge up to, depending on battery size, 400-mile trip or longer. Delivery starts next year. I am delighted to report to you that doctors care about transport policy for health reasons. I'm proud to say that the Washington State Medical Association passed a resolution that says this. I won't read it to you, you can read it. I'm a delegate to the House of Delegates for State Medical Association from Pierce County. And it was a steep grade, a whole lot more than 1%, I can tell you, to get this accepted. It was watered down. We had the reference committee tossed out a lot of other things, good things that could have been in there, but they specifically called out rail. First time ever in Washington State that doctors have said, think about it. Take a look. Let's make some good policy here that takes care of our health. On the left panel, I'm the guy way in the back, I think. Nah, I'm messing with you. It's 1914. That's World War I medical evacuation. And on the right is what the inside of those cars looked like for evacuation of the wounded. For those of us on the west side of the Cascades, at some point in the next 600 years, while you're still alive, Tom, there's going to be an earthquake there, right? 9.0, that sort of thing. What's going to happen to the healthcare facilities when that happens? Shout it out. Just say boom, right? Right? Yeah. So what we count on, 911, and 4.5 minutes later, the rig shows up with EMS and they lights and sirens, and off we go to the nearest hospital where we wait for hours probably, but at least we get medical care. We can't count on that. What we've not talked about, I was the AirVac validating flight surgeon for the Air Force for the war for a while, many years back. And there's a whole process of validation for flight. You can think of that as the ticket agent saying, okay, you got your money, okay, here's your ticket. There's a lot more involved because you have to be healthy enough to fly, because you have to be kept alive and well in that flight for several hours from the point of injury or the theater to where they're going. But it used to be done by train, of course, and when that changed, you MASH fans recall, that was done by helicopter very, very quickly. Patients flew on the outside of the helicopter. Now they fly inside. Yeah, it's true. Those pictures were accurate and were correct. But how are we going to get hundreds or thousands of injured people out of the area if the roads are gone, rails are gone? Now, of course, if the bridges are down, the trains aren't going to get there as well either. I keep telling myself to shut up over there. Almost done. But I would ask us to think about, if we think about transport policy, think about the possibility of getting people away from large disaster areas as well. We got the chance to figure it out in North Carolina and Florida, don't we? Yeah. We talked a little bit about this. I want to talk about actually commuting to the office at somewhere at the other end. There was a while when I'm a volunteer with these guys, and there was a while when I was still working for money. I'd commute to work from my home in Steilacoom, midway between Olympia and Tacoma, and go south to Vancouver. Took a couple of hours on the train, the morning train, left about 8, got down there about 10, worked for about 6 hours, got on the evening one and came home. And it worked. It worked because I could work. One of our panelists talked about productive time. You're not going to get a doc to drive from Seattle to Yakima or points in between. It isn't going to happen whether the road's clear or not because of the value of productive time. But if he or she can be working, writing reports, or even reading a medical journal to catch up while he or she is commuting for an hour, that's a great use of time. Think about that as a possibility. Take the doc to the patients rather than 20 patients to the doc to see the doc. So think about that possibility as well. All right, let's end on a funny note. Take a look at that. If you can't see in the back row, it's a Tesla with a gas generator hooked on the back for recharging. And that's a real interchange. Anybody know where that is? Shout it out. It's 1604 and 10 in San Antonio, on the nice side. That is a real freeway. That isn't just made up. Highway designers, please don't do that. Let's think of a better way. All right, here's where we are. Here's who we are. Thank you very much for your attention. We've got a few minutes for questions. I'll sit down. Anna, are you still on?
Yes,
Let's
I
see if
am
she has-
here. Hello.
Wonderful. We'll give you first rights of questions. So if any of you have questions for Anna, let me see if we can, somebody maybe run this around. Any questions for Anna for questions about the non-driving so-called disability community? While you're thinking of your questions, any questions for any of the rest of us here?
She has 2 devices.
Go ahead. Tom, right in front of you.
Can you talk a little bit about the availability of healthcare in tribal areas? For example, what % of routine medical care is provided by Indian Health Service facilities?
I can't. Can either of you?
Go ahead.
Do you have a mic?
Microphone, please.
Is this on?
Yep.
So the IHS that is in Yakima Nation, a lot of people think that that facility only serves tribal members. It does not, because it's Department of Health and Human Services. So they also have to serve non-tribal members. So tribal members who are already isolated from healthcare have to compete with non-tribal members for healthcare that's supposed to be guaranteed to tribal members. And so not everywhere is there an Indian health facility. For example, in my travels, I went to Oneida Nation. They had a single wide trailer. One office was one of the bedrooms, which was a dental facility and an emergency room. And the main bedroom, because it was a 2-bedroom facility, was the medical office and supplies. And so they had literally a line of benches outside of tribal members who were waiting to get inside. That was one of the most complicated and challenging IHSs I've ever seen. So when you think about those kind of things, that the assumption is that, oh, all tribes have healthcare. That's not the case. However, I have seen a positive, like with the Muckleshoot Nation. They built their own clinic. They have their own facility. Crow Nation has their own hospital. But the problem is, where's the doctors? Where's the medical trained personnel? So that's the challenge, is if you have a facility but you have nobody to treat patients, you have an empty building. And so there's always these complications of transportation, getting to and from those facilities. Because like he was saying, the doctors started coming from Billings to Crow to treat patients, but it was an hour during the summer and 2 hours in the winter. And they're not gonna waste their time doing that. So those are some of the challenges. And also the other thing is that a lot of people don't know is doctors come and go, nurses come and go through IHS because if they serve for, I think it's 4 years after college, they get to do away with some of their loans. But what they do is they do their 4 years and then they leave. And then they're gone. And then we're right back where we started again with nobody to take care of anybody. So even though there's IHS, it's a gray area of a whole bunch of things. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Other questions? Over here?
Question about the medical survey. A few years ago, the Rail Passengers Association did something similar, but less concentrated geographically. We found some interesting results. Well, I would say that the mode itself had advantages. People with oxygen tanks, people with casts, things that were ungainly on airplanes and buses and so forth. I'm curious, given the fact that one of your specific questions regarded would a train help, I'm curious if any of your responses highlighted specific things about the mode itself that would help the situation, or and just generally what you heard.
Yeah, I think for time's sake, I focused just on those quotes that I mentioned. But one big focus of the study was talking about how restoration of the North Coast Hiawatha through Yakima, how would that help in this situation? Unfortunately, in terms of our quantitative data, like for instance, asking what kind of service would work, how frequent that service would be, we didn't get enough data to make like a concrete claim. But from what the respondents mentioned is that it is more like stable as a medium. It's more accessible, especially if you need to take on like an IV pole, or if you need like space for especially like bulky equipment. Another quote that I didn't get to was patients being unable to tolerate being in a car for 2.5 hours because it's just naturally very confined. But I think overall, the big reason why we wanted to focus on restorations of trains in particular, and not, for instance, expanding bus services, was because we're adding another supportive reason why we want to support restoration of rail, in addition to the climate effects, the economic effects. Expanding bus services could certainly help too, but that was just our main focus. I hope that answers your question.
While we're waiting for that question, just to clarify, none of us are proposing this for emergency medical care. This is for routine access to specialty care that's not available locally. Routine access to specialty care not available locally for someone who's safe to travel for that 2 to 3 hour journey.
I was just going to share a story we heard about a Boise family with an infant and a rare eye condition. They visited Salt Lake monthly for care at Primary Children's, but because of her eye condition, she needed to be in total darkness. So air travel was out of the question, too expensive monthly, so they were in the car. But being a baby, they had to get her fed every few hours and keep her completely dark. So they shared that story as a support of rail being more flexible for those kinds of constraints on medical conditions.
As I walk this over to Charlie for our next question, I have a quick one. I'm happy to hear that the Washington State Medical Association supports rail, but I noticed the wording was supports rail and single occupancy vehicles. What about
Non-single occupancy.
non-single
Yes.
occupancy vehicles? What about freight rail, knowing that it's a more efficient mode of transportation and can cut down on greenhouse gas emissions? Do you think there's a possibility that the WSMA would support not only passenger rail, but rail generally?
Maybe in the future. It's because both WPSR and WSMA support electrification of transport generally across the board, and particularly single occupancy vehicle electrification. They didn't say catenary, because you can't confuse the doctors with getting into those details, but clean electrical, which clean charging, they would be more likely to support. Partial answer.
And this is just a footnote. The study that Gleb did is available on the All Aboard Washington website at aawa.us. So if you search there, you'll find Gleb's wonderful work. Thank you.
I think I'm going to call it at this point. You all have been very patient, and it's time for the next panel. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for the privilege.